clatter of a stainless steel tray hitting the white tile floor of the emergency room rang out like a gunshot in the middle of the night. The entire ER at Silver Cross Medical Center in Las Vegas ground to a halt under the harsh, cold fluorescent lights. A medication vial shattered at the base of an examination table, its clear liquid pooling amidst the sharp, overpowering scent of antiseptic. Heart monitors beeped frantically. An elderly patient in the waiting area clutched his chest. A young mother pulled her little boy tight against the wall. From the nurse's station, an urgent call crackled over the radio. Code Gray in Bay 3. 3 security guards rushed over, their boots pounding heavily against the tile. But what made everyone back away wasn't the alarm. It was the low, guttural growl rumbling from the metal crate near the ER doors. Inside was Diesel, a massive working German shepherd, his black and tan fur bristling with every breath. His front paws pressed hard against the bottom of the crate, claws scraping against the metal with a sharp, grating sound. He bared his teeth, but he didn't lunge at the crowd. He wasn't biting wildly at the bars. His entire body was angled toward the hospital bed, where a man in a pale blue hospital gown was being held down. That man was Owen Miller, a former Marine who had served in Afghanistan. On his arm, exposed by the short sleeve of his gown, a United States Marine Corps tattoo had faded over the years, yet remained clear enough to serve as a reminder that before becoming a high-risk case in a hospital file, he was a soldier. Owen's wrists were flushed red beneath the restraints. Sweat poured down his temples. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, as if this cold, white room was morphing into another battlefield inside his head. But that night, no one looked at Owen like a panicked veteran. They looked at him like a threat. Dr. Victor Lang emerged from Bay 3, one hand clutching the torn shoulder of his white coat. His face wore the appropriate tension of someone who had just been attacked, but his eyes were entirely too lucid, too cold. The tear on his shoulder was a clean, straight line under the stark white lights. "Doctor." Lang scanned the hallway, then spoke with a definitive tone, as if the matter had already been settled. "The patient assaulted me. The canine has become aggressive. Call animal control. Prep a sedative now." His words dropped like a death sentence. A young nurse covered her mouth with her hand. The nearest security guard raised his baton. An intern backed away until he bumped into a supply cabinet. In their eyes, the situation was clear-cut. An out-of-control veteran, a dangerous dog, an injured doctor, and a protocol that needed to be executed immediately to restore order to the hospital. Only Rachel Adams didn't see it that way. Rachel had just stepped out of the medication room, a pair of latex gloves still pinched between her fingers. She was the night shift nurse. The small name tag on her chest read, R. Adams, RN. At Silver Cross, she held no real authority. She wasn't the head nurse, she wasn't the attending physician, and she certainly wasn't someone management would listen to during an emergency. People often said she was too soft on veteran patients, too slow to sign off on forms, and too prone to asking questions in a place where people only wanted to hear 2 words. Yes, doctor. But because she always looked a little longer than everyone else, Rachel saw what was being overlooked. She looked at Owen first. He didn't have the eyes of someone hunting for a target to attack. He had the eyes of someone being dragged backward into a memory, someone seeing things no one else in the room could see. His shoulders twitched whenever someone approached from behind. His hands gripped the edge of the bed as if clinging to the present to keep from falling back into some dark night on a battlefield. Every time a security guard's boot struck the floor, his pupils dilated. Then, Rachel looked at Diesel. The dog was still growling, but his center of gravity was incredibly low. That wasn't an indiscriminate attack posture. It was a protective stance. His muzzle wasn't pointed at the trembling mother, the young nurse, or the crowd. It was aimed at the empty space between Owen and Dr. Lang. In a split second, Diesel's gaze flicked up toward the hallway ceiling, then back to his handler, as if trying to draw someone's attention to something that couldn't be said with words. "Nurse Adams." "Doctor," Lang barked upon seeing her approach. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not approach the patient." Rachel heard the order loud and clear. So did the rest of the hallway. It wasn't just meant to stop her. It was meant to put her exactly where the system wanted her, a subordinate nurse who needed to stay quiet once the doctor had dictated the narrative. But Rachel kept walking. She didn't charge in like someone trying to prove her bravery. She walked slowly, arms open, palms facing downward so both Owen and Diesel could see she wasn't holding a syringe, restraints, or a baton. With every step she took, the ER grew a little quieter. The guards gave her baffled looks. Head nurse, Marlene Price, scowled from the nurse's station. Doctor. Lang stood up straighter, his gaze sharpening. Rachel, step back right now, Marlene snapped. This isn't your concern. Rachel didn't turn around. She stopped just a few paces from Owen's bed, close enough for him to hear her, but far enough away that he wouldn't feel cornered. One of the guards moved to circle behind Owen's shoulders to pin him down. Owen immediately jerked violently. The heart monitor blared in rapid succession. Diesel slammed his chest against the crate door, the rattling metal sending the people behind him stumbling backward in panic. Don't touch him from behind, Rachel said, her voice low but steady. It'll trigger a stronger reaction. The guard froze, not because he believed her, but because Diesel had just unleashed a deeper, more menacing growl, as if seconding her every word. Doctor, Lang clenched his jaw. You are interfering with a medical procedure. Rachel still didn't look at him. She lowered her stance slightly, ensuring Owen wouldn't perceive her as a threat looming over him. Amidst the whir of machinery, Diesel's heavy panting, and the sterile chill of the antiseptic, she addressed him using a title no one else had used all night. Sergeant Miller. Owen froze. Just 2 words, but they struck the last remaining shred of honor within him. Not agitated patient, not attacker, not ER problem. Rachel addressed him as someone who once held a rank, who once had a mission, who had a life before this cold, white room reduced him to a medical file that needed to be restrained. Owen's hands still trembled, but his death grip on the bed rails loosened. He blinked, staring at Rachel as if trying to figure out if the voice was real. Diesel changed too. The growl in his throat quieted, morphing into heavy, rhythmic breathing. His dark brown eyes shifted away from Dr. Lang and locked onto Rachel. He was still on high alert, still strung tight as a bowstring, but he was no longer throwing himself against the cage. Rachel lowered her right hand a fraction more, palm parallel to the floor. Then, she spoke very softly. Stand down, Marine. This time, Diesel went completely still. His snout dropped a few inches. His ears twitched. The tense muscles in his shoulders began to relax, even though his eyes never left Owen. He didn't lie down, and he didn't drop his guard entirely, but he stopped. A K-9 that the entire hospital had just deemed dangerous had obeyed a night shift nurse with a single command. The silence that followed was heavier than the initial clatter of the stainless steel tray. The nearest security guard slowly lowered his baton. Marlene stared at Rachel as if she had just performed something inexplicable. Dr. Lang was the only one who didn't look surprised in the typical sense. A flash of annoyance crossed his eyes, cold, sharp, and fleeting, like a man who had just seen his plan delayed by an unforeseen detail. Rachel remained standing between Owen and the people who wanted to further restrain him. On the wall, a small American flag hanging next to a veteran tribute plaque fluttered faintly from the draft of the automatic doors. Under the glaring white lights, the tear on Dr. Lang's coat became much clearer. The rip was clean, straight, far too neat to be the bite mark of a working dog. Rachel saw it. Diesel seemed to have seen it too, but the rest of the hallway hadn't caught on yet. Doctor. Lang pulled his coat together, dropping his voice. One lucky command doesn't change the facts. This dog is a danger. Put it in the chart. The patient assaulted medical staff, and the K-9 exhibited threatening behavior. We are going to follow protocol. The word protocol sent a chill down Rachel's spine. Once the words violent patient were entered into the system, Owen would lose his voice. Once Diesel was flagged as a dangerous K-9, the dog could be taken away before anyone bothered to ask what he was trying to warn them about. Owen struggled to lift his head. His voice was hoarse, cracking in his throat. Don't take Diesel. Diesel let out a soft whine. It was no longer a growl. It was the sound of a creature realizing that the person he was sworn to protect was about to be ripped away from him. Rachel looked around. No one stepped forward. A few colleagues avoided her gaze. Some were afraid of losing their jobs. Some believed Dr. Lang. Some knew something was wrong but didn't have the courage to call it out. The system doesn't need everyone to be cruel. It just needs the majority to stay silent at the right time. Rachel stepped sideways, blocking the metal crate. Marlene froze. "Rachel, what are you doing?" Rachel didn't raise her voice, nor did she tremble. "Before taking Diesel away, I want this incident fully documented. Not just the doctor's statement, the patient's reaction, the K9's reaction, and exactly what happened before the tray hit the floor." Dr. Lang stared at her for a long time. "You don't have the authority to demand that," Rachel replied slowly, making sure every single person in the ER heard her. "Then put it in the chart that I demanded it." The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. Diesel sat down behind the bars, his eyes tracking Rachel. Owen lay on the bed, his chest heaving, his trembling hand trying to reach out toward the dog that hadn't abandoned him. "Doctor," Lang stood under the fluorescent lights, the torn fabric on his shoulder held tight by his clenched fingers. "What do you think Rachel realized in the moment Diesel stopped? Was it the strange tear on the white coat, Owen's eyes, or the way the K9 kept looking at the hallway ceiling?" Leave your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to let us know which city you're watching from. That night, no one yet understood how an ordinary nurse knew the exact phrase to stop a working K9 in its tracks. But at Silver Cross Medical Center, under the harsh white lights and the heavy scent of antiseptic, something had started to shift. Rachel Adams was no longer standing on the sidelines. She had just stepped into the danger zone of a buried truth. The door to the small conference room behind the ER shut with a sharp, hollow click. The sound wasn't loud, but to Rachel Adams, it felt as though the hospital had just dropped a steel wall between her and the two lives out there that desperately needed protecting. Inside, the room held only a long faux wood table, a few gray swivel chairs, a coffee maker gone cold from the previous shift, and harsh fluorescent lighting that washed out every face. A large framed photo hung on the wall. Doctors, nurses, and donors standing beneath an American flag, bearing the inscription, "Honoring those who served." Rachel stared at those words, then thought of Owen Miller lying out in the hallway, his wrists rubbed raw under the restraints, and Diesel locked in a metal crate like a hazard that needed to be disposed of. The stark contrast made the room feel even colder. Silver Cross Medical Center always knew how to put on a humanitarian face. The polished main lobby, the veteran tribute wall wiped spotless every morning, the American flags placed next to photos of smiling veterans at honor ceremonies. On Memorial Day or Veterans Day, the hospital would invite local reporters to film doctors shaking hands with servicemen, nurses pushing wheelchairs down the halls, and children handing flowers to those who had returned from the battlefield. On social media, everything was crafted with kind words: gratitude, dedication, serving our heroes. But Rachel had worked enough night shifts to know a hospital could have two faces. One face was for the cameras, the donors, and the billboards. The other lived behind the reception desk, in closed-door meetings about insurance, legal liabilities, and length of stay. Back there, a veteran was no longer called a hero if he became too difficult to manage. Prolonged PTSD became a cost. An accompanying service dog became a nuisance. A patient with a history of complaints or the potential to sue became a PR liability. They never used cruel words. They used sanitized ones, standardizing protocols, mitigating risk, protecting the brand, avoiding bad precedents. It was that exact sterility that was terrifying, because it could crush a human being without leaving a single fingerprint. Marlene Price, the night shift charge nurse, pulled down the blinds over the glass and turned to look at Rachel. In her 50s, with her hair pulled into a tight bun, her scrubs were entirely wrinkle-free. Marlene wasn't the type to yell to prove her authority. She was dangerous in a quieter way. She knew how to spin an order into a piece of advice, turn silence into a duty, and twist a conscientious act into a disciplinary infraction. "Take a seat, Rachel." Rachel remained standing by the door. "Owen needs to be reassessed before he's written up for assaulting staff. And Diesel shouldn't be taken away without an independent evaluation." Marlene placed a thin file folder on the table. Owen Miller's name sat at the top corner of the page, followed by cold clinical notes. History of PTSD, agitated response, violent risk, requires safety restraints. Every word was neat, standardized, and perfectly aligned with protocol. But there wasn't a single word mentioning that Owen had frozen when addressed as Sergeant Miller. Not a single line noting that Diesel had stood down at a single command. There was no blank space to suggest that a working dog might have been issuing a warning rather than launching an attack. "You just defied a doctor's order in the ER," Marlene said. "I just stopped them from making a bad situation worse." "You don't have the authority to make that call." Rachel stared at the file for a long moment. She knew that once those few lines were entered into the system, the truth would be permanently derailed. A veteran flagged as violent would have a much harder time being believed in any future treatment. AK-9, labeled as dangerous, could be taken from its handler before anyone bothered to ask what it had seen. "Diesel wasn't acting like an attack dog," Rachel said, keeping her voice low. "He was shielding Owen. He reacted when people approached from behind. He looked up at the hallway ceiling before looking back at his handler. I'm not saying it's definitive proof, but it's enough reason not to condemn them just yet." Marlene looked at her, exhaustion in her eyes. "You're risking your career on a handful of details you can't prove." "Then let the cameras prove it." The room fell dead silent. Marlene's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the file, a micro movement, almost imperceptible. But Rachel caught it. She was used to spotting the minute ticks of patients right before a panic attack, used to reading the truth in the hesitation between two sentences. "The camera in Bay 3 is currently being serviced by maintenance," Marlene replied. "What about the hallway camera?" "It's irrelevant to the current protocol. If it recorded what happened before the tray hit the floor, it's highly relevant." Marlene closed the file. "Rachel, listen to me very carefully. Dr. Lang is a senior contracted physician. The hospital is about to renew its veteran care program with a major partner. This week, we have donor representatives, internal audits, and media presence. An incident spun in the wrong direction could get this entire department in serious trouble." Rachel looked her dead in the eye. "Which direction is the wrong direction? The one that's bad for the hospital, or the one that's bad for Owen?" The air in the room thickened. Marlene didn't answer right away. Outside, the sound of gurney wheels rolling down the hall and the faint, rhythmic beeping of monitors seeped through the walls. Rachel knew she had just touched the nerve no one wanted to name. Marlene walked around the table, stepping closer to her. Her voice dropped, sounding less like a reprimand and more like a grave warning. "Silver Cross is not kind to people who make themselves a problem. You think you're protecting a patient, but when the disciplinary report is filed, that's not what they'll write. They'll write that you were insubordinate, that you interfered with medical treatment, and that you increased the risk to staff. A line like that can follow you for a very long time." Rachel felt the weight of that warning press against her chest. Her small apartment in North Las Vegas still had unpaid bills sitting on the counter. Her mother in Reno still believed her daughter finally had a stable career. Her years of nursing school, the student debt, the exhausting back-to-back shifts, all of it could be jeopardized by a single report written in a cold, professional tone. But then she remembered Owen's hoarse voice out in the hallway. "Don't take Diesel." She remembered the K-9's eyes after she said, "Stand down, Marine." Diesel hadn't looked at her like a dog obeying a stranger's command. He had looked at her like a sentry who had just found the only person calm enough to understand his signal. The rattle of metal wheels echoed outside the door. Rachel turned. Through the frosted glass, she saw two guards preparing to roll Diesel's crate out of the ER. The dog wasn't growling anymore. He stood motionless inside the cage, his head turned back toward Bay 3, where Owen was hidden behind the curtain. It was that very silence that made Rachel's throat tighten. A creature that the entire hospital had just labeled as vicious was no longer fighting back. He was simply waiting. And sometimes, the silent wait of the voiceless cuts deeper than any growl. "Animal control isn't here yet," Marlene said. "They're just moving him down to a holding area. If Diesel leaves this floor, the narrative will be written before anyone actually examines him." Rachel placed her hand on the doorknob. The metal was icy against her palm. "Rachel?" Marlene called out. She stopped. "Beyond that door, no one is going to protect you." Rachel looked through the frosted glass, where the crate was just starting to move. "If I stay in here, no one is going to protect Owen either." She opened the door. The sounds of the ER flooded in instantly. The monitors, the radios, the clatter of gurney wheels, a voice calling for meds from the supply room. Rachel stepped out just as Diesel's crate was being rolled past the conference room. The dog turned his head to look at her. No scratching, no growling. Just a gaze from dark brown eyes, exhausted and vigilant. Rachel stepped in front of the crate's wheels, blocking its path. The two guards stopped short. Marlene stepped out behind her. A few nurses at the central station looked up. Further down, Doctor. Lang turned around from the end of the hallway, his expression darkening when he saw that Rachel still refused to disappear from the narrative. "If we're talking about protocol," Rachel said, her voice not loud but carrying clearly through the quieting hallway, "then let's follow protocol exactly. Keep Diesel here until there's an independent evaluation. Fully document Owen's reaction, the K-9's reaction, and review the security footage before entering a single line that condemns them." Dr. Lang walked slowly toward her. The torn white coat still hung on his shoulder like a piece of evidence put on display for the entire hospital to see. "Nurse Adams," he said, every word clipped beneath a veneer of icy calm, "you are severely overstepping your bounds." Rachel stared straight back at him. In that moment, she understood it clearer than ever. What stood before her wasn't just an arrogant doctor. Behind him was a hospital that knew how to hang American flags in the lobby, knew how to smile for the cameras, and knew how to use polite words to bury ugly truths. In a system like that, a lone, former Marine and his loyal K-9 could be erased with just a few typed notes. If you've ever seen an underdog get turned on by their entire workplace just because their truth was inconvenient for those in power, hit that like button to support people who dare to stand up, just like Rachel in this story. Rachel didn't know if, after tonight, she would lose her shifts, the trust of her superiors, or her entire career. But she knew one thing for certain. Owen Miller was not just a violent medical file. Diesel was not just a dangerous dog. And Silver Cross Medical Center was nowhere near as clean as the pictures hanging in the main lobby. As Dr. Lang looked at her with eyes so cold they didn't even require a threat, Rachel finally realized the most terrifying part of it all. This wasn't just an incident in the ER. This was systemic cruelty. Rachel stood, blocking Diesel's crate a beat longer than a night shift nurse ever should. The entire ER hallway was pulled taut like a tripwire. The two security guards kept their hands on the crate, not daring to push any further. Marlene Price stood behind Rachel, terrifyingly silent. At the end of the hall, Dr. Victor Lang stared at her with the eyes of a man accustomed to making people back down, using nothing but the title on his badge. But Rachel held her ground. She looked at Diesel first. The German Shepherd remained standing in the crate, his massive frame taking up almost all of the cramped metal space. He wasn't growling anymore, but his entire body remained in a state of high alert. His nose twitched, taking quick sniffs of the medication, the blood, the antiseptic, and the distinct scent of human fear, sweat. His ears pricked up when Dr. Lang took a step forward, then lowered ever so slightly when Rachel leaned in to position herself between the dog and the doctor. That wasn't a coincidence. Rachel had seen similar reactions in her father. After leaving the military, her dad, Tom Adams, never talked much about Iraq. He never mentioned the convoys rolling through the desert, the explosions beneath the Humvees, or why he always sat facing the door in every diner. But he had a service dog named Mason, an aging German Shepherd with a small scar near his left eye. When she was little, Rachel didn't understand why Mason always wedged his body between her father and any stranger who approached too fast. She only remembered the nights her dad would wake up to the sound of rain lashing against the window, his breath shattering, eyes wide as if staring down a smoke-filled road. Mason would climb onto the bed, press his chest against her father's legs, and anchor him to the present until those trembling hands stopped searching for a rifle that was no longer there. When Rachel was 17, during one of her father's panic attacks in a grocery store parking lot triggered by a loud car exhaust backfiring, a security guard tried to restrain him from behind. Mason almost bit the man, not because he was vicious, but because he knew a sudden hand on the shoulder of a soldier trapped in a memory could instantly turn fear into a survival reflex. After that night, her father told her something she never forgot. Don't look at the panic as aggression. Look at what they're trying to protect. Now, standing in the cold, antiseptic-smelling hallway of Silver Cross, those words echoed in her mind so clearly it was as if her father were standing right next to her. Owen Miller wasn't trying to attack the whole ER. He was trying to protect Diesel from being dragged away. Diesel didn't want to bite the entire hospital staff. He was trying to protect Owen from something that had happened in Bay 3, something still hanging in the air even though the stainless steel tray was now lying still on the floor. Rachel turned her head slightly toward the hospital bed. Through the gap between the two security guards, she saw Owen lying on his side under the glaring white lights. His eyes were open but unfocused. His throat bobbed as if trying to speak. His right hand curled into a fist, then uncurled, 3 fingers tapping very lightly against the edge of the bed. 1, 2, 3. Then a pause. 1, 2, 3. No one noticed. To the others, it was just the unconscious twitch of an agitated patient. To Rachel, it looked like a signal. She had seen her father do the exact same thing on the kitchen table whenever he fought to keep himself from spiraling into a flashback. 3 taps to anchor to the present. 3 taps to remind himself. This isn't the battlefield. This isn't an explosion. This isn't that night. Rachel walked slowly toward Owen's bed. "Don't get any closer," Dr. Lang said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was as sharp as a scalpel's edge. Rachel stopped, not out of fear, but because she saw Owen's shoulders instantly tense the moment Dr. Lang's voice rang out. The reaction was too fast, too obvious. Owen hadn't reacted like that to Marlene. He hadn't reacted like that to the guards. Only to Dr. Lang. A tiny puzzle piece clicked into place. Rachel reached down to grab a clean paper towel from a supply cart and placed it on the edge of the bed, just within reach of Owen's hand. She didn't touch him. She didn't force him to look at her. She didn't bombard him with questions. People trapped in trauma rarely need another commanding voice. They need an exit wide enough to walk themselves out of. "Sergeant Miller," she said slowly, "you're at Silver Cross, Las Vegas. No one is touching Diesel right now." Owen blinked. His breathing was still heavy, but the finger tapping stopped. Rachel glanced down at his left wrist. Under the restraint, the skin wasn't just red from struggling. There was a finger-shaped bruise, slightly off-center toward the inside, the mark of a forceful grip that had happened before everything turned to chaos. She looked at his other arm. There was a similar mark, fainter, but clear enough under the harsh lights. If Owen was the one who had lunged at Dr. Lang, why did his wrists show signs of being pinned down beforehand? Rachel didn't say a word. She simply filed it away. Across the hallway, Diesel suddenly let out a low whine. It wasn't a warning. It was almost an urging. Rachel looked up and caught his eye. The dog stared at her, then glanced back up at the hallway ceiling. This time, Rachel followed his gaze much closer. The main security camera was mounted in the center of the ceiling, its red light blinking normally. But near the air vent on the left side, there was a smaller device, almost swallowed by the shadows of the corner. A secondary camera, the kind used to monitor hallway blind spots. There was something dark smeared across its lens, not clear enough to identify from this distance, but unusual enough to make the hair on the back of Rachel's neck stand up. "Doctor." Lang stepped forward, blocking her line of sight. "Nurse Adams," he said, his voice low. "You've been warned one too many times." The moment he stepped closer, Diesel instantly shot up in his crate. No barking, no lunging, just standing, his entire body rigid like a barricade. Owen also turned his head away. His jaw clenched so tight the veins popped. Rachel observed the simultaneous reaction of both man and dog. Working dogs don't react to guilt in the human sense. They react to scents, voices, cadences, conditioned memories, and movements previously associated with danger. Diesel didn't hate Dr. Lang because he was the villain of the story. He was terrified and issuing warnings because his body had witnessed something that human words were actively denying. "He needs space," Rachel said. "He needs medication." "Doctor," Lang countered. "A PTSD patient who is restrained from behind, separated from his service dog, and then injected in the middle of a panic attack is not going to calm down. You know that." Dr. Lang's eyes darkened. "Are you lecturing me on medicine?" Rachel didn't argue. She just stared at the shoulder of his white coat. The tear was still there, neat and straight. If Diesel had actually lunged at him, the fabric would have been pulled askew by the force, likely leaving jagged puncture marks and threads unraveling in multiple directions. This rip looked like it had been quickly slashed with something sharp, then tugged by hand to appear more chaotic. Once again, she stayed silent. It wasn't the right time. Marlene stepped closer, her voice even lower than before. "Rachel, get out. Right now." Rachel looked at Owen. He was looking back at her with bloodshot eyes, both terrified and much more lucid than he had been earlier. His fingers twitched, lightly pushing the edge of the paper towel Rachel had just set down. On it, with a motion that barely possessed any strength, he dragged a short line using his sweat-dampened fingernail. Then, another. 2 intersecting lines. Not a letter, a clumsy X. Rachel lowered her eyes, her heart pounding. A man deemed totally out of control was still trying to leave a signal. Not a full testimony, not a complete story. Just a sign that something was deeply wrong. "What do you want me to check?" she asked very quietly, almost exclusively for Owen's ears. Owen's eyes shifted upward, slow and pained, looking toward the hallway ceiling. Diesel let out another whine. 3 signals aligned. The dog's gaze, Owen's reaction, and the secondary camera tucked into the dark corner. Rachel knew she had just crossed the line from standard suspicion into something much more dangerous. But she also knew that if she called it out right now, Dr. Lang would have time to wipe away whatever evidence remained. She needed a closer look. She needed to verify it before the system could write off all her questions as pure paranoia. "All right," Rachel said, loud enough for the others to hear. "I'll step out." Dr. Lang looked at her as if he'd just won a minor skirmish. Marlene let out a breath, so softly it was practically soundless. The 2 guards eased their grip on Owen's shoulders, but Diesel still refused to sit. He knew Rachel hadn't actually abandoned the fight. Rachel walked out of Bay 3. As she passed the supply cart, she discreetly swiped a small penlight and slipped it into her scrub pocket. The movement was entirely natural. Nobody noticed. Years of nursing had taught her that there were plenty of ways to observe without letting anyone know they were being observed. Out in the hallway, the fluorescent lights still burned stark white. The medical equipment still beeped in a steady rhythm. But to Rachel, the space had entirely shifted. Every corner of the ceiling, every shadow of a camera, and every one of Dr. Lang's footsteps now carried a heavy, new weight. She paused in front of the supply room door near Bay 3. From there, it was just a short walk to the service corridor that led up to the security feed room. No one was guarding it, because no one would ever suspect a night shift nurse would dare investigate something management hadn't authorized. Rachel placed her hand on the icy doorknob. Behind her, Owen was breathing heavily behind the curtain. Diesel stood frozen in his crate, his eyes locked on her unblinkingly. Down the hall, Dr. Lang was murmuring something to Marlene, though his eyes occasionally darted in Rachel's direction. She understood the danger of what she was about to do. If she got caught, they would have a perfect excuse to claim she breached the system, defied orders, and launched a rogue investigation. A nurse has no right to go digging for the truth when that truth could embarrass the hospital. But her father had told her something else during his final days, back when Mason was too old to even climb onto the bed anymore. There are times you don't need to know the whole story to do the right thing. You just need to recognize who is being misunderstood by the entire room. Rachel took a slow breath in. The smells of antiseptic, metal, and stale coffee mingled in the air. She zipped her pocket up a fraction so the penlight wouldn't fall out, then stepped into the service corridor. Behind her, Diesel let out a very faint sigh, almost like an entrustment. Rachel Adams was no longer an observer. She was stepping alone into the danger zone that Owen and Diesel had been desperately trying to show her. The service corridor behind Bay 3 was narrower than Rachel expected. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting thin streaks of illumination across the gray tile floor. The noise of the ER behind her grew distant, as if muffled beneath a thick pane of glass. All that remained was the steady hum of the air conditioning, the sound of her shoes hitting the floor, and the heavy thud of her own heartbeat in her ears. Rachel didn't go too far. She knew if she disappeared from the ER for too long, Doctor, Lang would have an excuse to say she abandoned her post during an emergency. She just needed to see enough to confirm what Diesel and Owen had been trying to show her. From the corner of the service corridor, she looked up. The main camera mounted in the center of the ceiling was still blinking its red light. But the small camera near the air vent, the one Diesel had glanced at multiple times, sat askew in the shadows like an eye forced shut. Across its lens was a strip of black electrical tape, its edges peeling slightly from the cold AC draft. Rachel felt her throat go dry. She didn't touch it, didn't take it down, didn't do anything that could let someone accuse her of tampering with evidence. She just stood beneath it for a few seconds, looking closely, burning the image into her memory. The position, the angle, the tape, the adjacent air vent, the thin layer of dust on the edge of the camera housing. A small detail, but heavy enough to drag Dr. Lang's entire narrative out of its safe haven. When Rachel returned to Bay 3, Owen was still lying on the gurney, half his face bathed in the harsh white light. The restraint still held his wrists, but the security guards had backed further away per her request. Diesel was still in his crate, positioned right by the door. The dog was no longer growling. He sat upright, his eyes tracking Rachel from the moment she appeared at the end of the hall until she stepped inside, as if every second she had been gone was a test. Dr. Lang was no longer in the room. Marlene was at the nurse's station, speaking quietly to another staff member. This was the only window of opportunity Rachel was going to get. She walked into Bay 3 and pulled a chair closer to Owen's bed, but didn't sit too close. She left enough space for him to breathe, enough for him to see the doorway, enough so he wouldn't feel cornered. Then she rested her hands on her knees, palms open, holding no pen, no needle, no chart. "Sergeant Miller," she said, her voice low. "I saw it." Owen didn't answer right away. His bloodshot eyes stayed fixed on her, exhausted and guarded. The pulse in his neck throbbed visibly with every beat. His lips were chapped. His entire body looked as if it were still bracing for a door to bang open, a sudden hand to grab his shoulder, or a needle to come at him from the side. Rachel didn't push. She just sat there, amidst the smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of the monitor, giving him the one thing no one else had given him all night: time. Diesel shifted in his crate. A faint metallic clink rang out. Owen immediately snapped his eyes toward the dog. Just seeing that Diesel was still there made his shoulders relax a fraction. Rachel realized it instantly. To Owen, Diesel wasn't just a service dog. Diesel was his final anchor to reality. Separating them right now would be no different than pulling the only bridge out from under a man standing over raging rapids. "I'm not going to let them take Diesel away without an independent evaluation," Rachel said. "But I need you to help me understand what happened. You don't have to tell me everything. Just start with what you remember." Owen closed his eyes. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, blending into the sweat on his temple. When he opened them again, his voice was so hoarse it sounded like it was being scraped from his throat. "He told me to sign." Rachel didn't immediately ask, "Sign what?" A question fired too quickly could make him shut down. She just nodded, very slightly, letting him know she was listening. "He said if I didn't sign, they'd put me down as uncooperative." Owen swallowed hard. "That Diesel would be deemed a hazard, that I wasn't stable enough to keep him." Rachel's hands tightened slightly on her knees. A wave of anger washed over her, fast, hot, and sharp, but she didn't let it show on her face. Owen didn't need another angry person in the room. He needed someone calm enough to keep the truth from shattering. "Dr. Lang said that?" Owen looked toward the door. His entire body tensed, as if merely speaking the man's name could summon him. Diesel stood up in the crate, silent but vigilant. Rachel lowered her voice even more. "He's not here right now." Owen looked at her, then gave a tiny nod. A long silence fell between them. Out in the hallway, a gurney rolled by, the rubber wheels squeaking softly and distantly against the tile. Rachel waited. She had learned from her father that trauma memories don't travel in a straight line. They come in fragments, a phrase, the smell of medicine, a flash of light, the clink of metal. Pull too hard, and the person telling the story falls right back into the place they're trying to escape. "Owen," she said, using his first name instead of his rank for the first time. "Diesel has looked up at the ceiling multiple times. You looked up there too. Is it because of the camera?" Owen's eyes widened a fraction. In that moment, Rachel knew she had hit the mark. He tried to lift his hand, but the restraint held it back. Rachel didn't rush to undo it. She merely placed a finger on the release buckle, then paused, letting him see she wasn't going to do anything sudden. "I'll loosen one side if you stay calm. Okay?" Owen looked at Diesel. The dog stood still, ears swiveled toward them. After a few seconds, Owen nodded. Rachel loosened the restraint on his right wrist. She did it slowly, notch by notch, so he wouldn't feel jerked around or manhandled. Once his wrist was free, he didn't swing his arm or fight. He just shakily touched the edge of the bed, then used his index finger to retrace the X he had tried to draw on the paper towel earlier. He covered it, Owen whispered. Rachel leaned in closer. The secondary camera? Owen nodded. His eyes grew glassy, but a painful spark of clarity had returned to them. Diesel saw it. He barked. I turned around. He hit me first. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rachel heard the monitor still beeping steadily, but the sound had suddenly grown very distant. She thought of the bruise on Owen's wrist, the clean tear on Dr. Lang's coat in her memory, the black tape over the secondary camera, small pieces that didn't yet make a full case, but were enough to form a preliminary truth. Owen wasn't lying. Diesel let out a soft whine from the crate. Owen turned toward the dog, his voice breaking. He was just trying to stop him. Rachel stood up and walked over to the crate. She didn't open the door, because if Dr. Lang walked back in right then, he would use it against her. She simply knelt in front of the bars, low enough for Diesel to see her face. The dog pressed his snout against the grating, his hot, heavy breath washing over her hand. Diesel, Rachel said very softly, you did the right thing. The dog blinked. A choked sound escaped his throat, not a growl, but not quite a whine, either. Rachel placed 2 fingers against the metal bars, not reaching inside, just resting them near. Diesel leaned his snout against them. The moment made a lump form in Rachel's throat. He wasn't a monster. He was a guardian, locked in a cage for doing his job exactly right. Owen watched the exchange. For the first time all night, his face held something other than fear. There was something softer, more fragile, as if he had just seen proof that the entire world hadn't abandoned him just yet. You believe me? He asked. That simple question carried the weight of years of being doubted, judged, documented, and treated as a liability rather than a human being. Rachel turned back to look at him. I believe that you and Diesel are trying to say something, and I believe we need to protect that truth before they write it for you. Owen closed his eyes. Another tear slipped down his temple. He didn't sob. Soldiers like him rarely cried loudly. Their pain fell silently, like water seeping into cracks in concrete. I don't want to lose him, he said. Diesel is the reason I'm still here. Rachel didn't need to ask if here meant in the hospital or in this world. She understood. She looked at the man on the gurney, then at the K9 behind the bars, and saw clearly what the system out there was willfully ignoring. This wasn't an agitated patient and a troublemaking dog. These were 2 souls who had kept each other alive through nights that no medical chart could ever quantify. Outside, Dr. Lang's voice echoed from the end of the hallway. Diesel immediately jerked his head up. Owen opened his eyes, his breathing stuttering. Rachel stood up straight. She pulled the blanket back over Owen, hiding his loosened wrist, then rested her hand on the bed rail, as if she were simply checking on the patient's condition. Listen to me, she said, quickly but gently. From now on, don't try to fight them physically. Let me figure out a way to secure that camera footage. You just need to stay calm, because they are waiting for you to react so they can use it as evidence against you. Owen looked at her. The fear was still there, but beneath it there was now a foothold. Who are you? He asked hoarsely. Rachel stayed silent for a second. The question made her think of her father, of old Mason lying under the kitchen table, of all the times she had seen wounded people mistakenly labeled as dangerous. I'm your nurse, she said, and for tonight, that's enough. Dr. Lang stepped into the doorway of Bay 3 just as Rachel turned back to the supply cart. His gaze swept from her to Owen, then stopped on Diesel. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, as if a freezer door had just been thrown open. Is the touching heart-to-heart over yet? He asked. Rachel didn't bite at the sarcasm. She just looked straight at him, calmer than before. She no longer had mere suspicions. She had Owen's word, Diesel's reactions, and the black tape over the secondary camera burned into her memory. But Owen still wasn't safe. Diesel was still in the cage, and Dr. Lang still had the authority to file his report before she could file hers. The story is just getting started. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the moment the truth is finally revealed in the upcoming parts. when Rachel goes head-to-head against the hospital's most ruthless orders. In that moment, as doctor, Lang stood under the glaring white lights. Rachel realized something else. Owen wasn't just holding on to the memory of an assault. He was holding on to a much larger secret, something that would make a doctor cover a security camera, frame a working K9, and spin a former Marine into an out-of-control threat. And if Rachel didn't act fast enough, that secret would be buried right alongside Owen Miller's honor. Doctor Victor Lang stood in the doorway of Bay 3, the torn white coat on his shoulder still untouched, like a piece of evidence intentionally put on display. Rachel looked at him, then at Owen. In mere seconds, she saw the former Marine's entire body alter. His recently loosened hand froze on the edge of the blanket. His shoulders hitched up. His throat worked a hard swallow. As for Diesel, inside the metal crate, the dog instantly stood tall, ears pricked up, his body tensing into a living shield. No one in the room needed to say another word. Doctor, Lang's mere presence was a threat in itself. Nurse Adams, he said, his voice so calm it was freezing. I believe you were asked to leave the treatment area. Rachel straightened the blanket over Owen, her movements slow and clinical, exactly like a nurse doing her duty. She didn't let the tension in her hands show. I am monitoring the patient's post-incident response. The patient just assaulted medical staff. The patient is experiencing a severe trauma response. Doctor? Lang looked at her as if she had just used a word forbidden in this room. To him, Owen wasn't a traumatized human being. Owen was a file that needed to be closed as quickly as possible. Marlene Price appeared behind Dr. Lang, holding a hospital tablet. Her face was tighter than before, but the argumentative edge was gone. It was the face of someone who had received orders from above and now only had a job to execute. Rachel saw it before Marlene even opened her mouth. Rachel, Marlene said, management has decided to move Diesel to a temporary holding area outside the main building. Animal control is on their way. Owen jerked halfway up, the restraint pulling taut against his other wrist. No, a single word, hoarse and thick, but carrying so much pain that the entire room seemed to sag. Diesel slammed against the crate door. The metal clanged violently, making a young nurse out in the hallway jump and drop her pen. But this time, Rachel didn't hear the roar of an out-of-control animal. She heard the desperation of a creature watching its handler being ripped away. Doctor, Lang pointed at the crate. That is exactly why it needs to be removed. It's agitating the patient. No, Rachel said. He is the only thing keeping him anchored to the present. Dr. Lang turned to her, his eyes darkening. I am not going to debate medical protocols with a night shift nurse in front of a patient. He threw that sentence out just loud enough for the people in the hallway to hear. Rachel felt a few pairs of eyes turn her way. Some were full of pity. Some were anxious. Some just wanted her to shut up so the shift could go back to normal. A hospital doesn't need to scream to isolate someone. Sometimes, it just takes a doctor using the right tone of voice in front of enough witnesses. Marlene stepped into the room and held out the tablet for Rachel to see. On the screen was an internal form, temporary removal of animal from clinical zone. At the bottom was a signature line for the witnessing nurse. We need you to sign this, Marlene said. Rachel stared at the text. Temporary. Removal. Clinical zone. Harmless words placed side by side to make a cruel act look like standard administrative paperwork. If I sign this, what will the report say? Rachel asked. Marlene avoided her eyes for a split second. That Diesel was removed from the clinical area to ensure safety. And Owen? Dr. Lang answered for her. The patient will be sedated according to protocol. Rachel looked at him. Which protocol? He's much more lucid when Diesel is near. Separating them and then sedating him during a panic attack is just a way to manufacture more evidence that he's dangerous. Are you accusing me of staging a scene? The question dropped fast. Too fast. As if Dr. Lang had been ready and waiting to twist any suspicion into an accusation of professional misconduct. Rachel didn't step into that trap. She kept her voice low, her eyes never leaving Owen. I am requesting a hold until we get an independent evaluation of the service dog and review the hallway camera. The word camera made Dr. Lang pause for a fraction of a second. Owen looked at Rachel. There was fear in his eyes, but also a painful sliver of hope. Diesel had stopped battering the crate. He stood completely still, his snout pressed against the bars, watching Rachel as if waiting to see if she truly understood his plea. "Doctor?" Lang turned to the two security guards standing at the door. "Take the dog." The two men exchanged a glance. One placed his hand on the crate's handle. The wheels squeaked faintly as the cage nudged forward. Owen immediately began to hyperventilate, the heart monitor alarming as his pulse spiked. His fingers dug into the blanket until his knuckles turned white. "Diesel," he called out, his voice cracking. The dog let out a low whine. It wasn't a sound of defiance. It was an answer. Rachel stepped forward. She didn't try to physically muscle her way between the guards and the cage. She simply placed one hand on the frame of the crate, right in front of the wheel, forcing the guard to stop unless he wanted to roll right over her hand. "Remove your hand," Dr. Lang ordered. Rachel didn't move. In that moment, she felt the full weight of her own insignificance. She was just a nurse in blue scrubs, standing against a senior contracted doctor, a charge nurse, hospital security, and a green-lit protocol. She didn't have a title big enough to shield her. No lawyer by her side. No evidence in her hands other than what her own eyes had seen and the broken words Owen had just managed to gasp out. But in that exact same moment, she also saw the simplest truth. If she pulled her hand away, Diesel would be taken. If Diesel was taken, Owen would break. And if Owen broke, Dr. Lang would have exactly what he needed to turn a lie into an official medical record. "Rachel," Marlene said, her voice turning raspy, "don't do this." Rachel looked at her. This time, she didn't see a strict head nurse. She saw a woman who knew exactly what was wrong but still chose the safety of compliance. Maybe Marlene was exhausted. Maybe she had been bent by the system one too many times. But Owen was out of time for sympathy for those excuses. "You know, separating them right now is wrong," Rachel said. Marlene didn't reply. That silence was answer enough. "Doctor," Lang stepped closer. "Nurse Adams, if you do not step away from that crate immediately, I will have you suspended for interfering with emergency medical treatment." Rachel heard every word like a padlock snapping shut on her future. Suspension, disciplinary action, a black mark on her record, loss of employment, loss of insurance, losing everything she had painstakingly built through grueling 12-hour shifts, mornings falling asleep in her car, and days returning to an empty apartment smelling of stale coffee. She was terrified, truly terrified, but that terror didn't make her pull her hand back. It only made her voice drop lower as she spoke. "Then make sure you write down the full reason for my suspension." Dr. Lang narrowed his eyes. Rachel turned to Marlene, then looked at the nurses standing just outside the door. "Write down that I refused to sign off on removing a former Marine Service, K9, from a clinical zone while the patient was in active panic, without an independent evaluation, before the hallway cameras were reviewed, and when the dog's very presence was the only thing stabilizing the patient." Nobody said a word. Even the heart monitor seemed to echo louder in that dead silence. Owen looked at her, his eyes bloodshot. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Diesel pressed his snout against the bars, his hot breath venting through the metal gaps. Rachel could feel her hand trembling on the crate, but she stopped trying to hide it. Courage isn't the absence of trembling. Courage is keeping your hand right there when everything is screaming at you to let go. "Doctor," Lang let out a faint scoff. "Do you honestly think a self-righteous speech is going to change hospital protocol?" "No," Rachel said. "I think the truth will." This time, his expression shifted visibly. Not much, but enough. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across his polished composure. Rachel knew she had just struck exactly what he feared. "Doctor," Lang whipped his head toward the guards. "Escort her out of the ER." One of the guards stepped forward. Rachel kept her hand firmly on the crate. Owen tried to force himself up, but Rachel immediately locked eyes with him, her voice gentle but firm. "Don't, Sergeant Miller. Don't give them a reason." Those words anchored Owen down. He fell back against the pillow, panting heavily, his eyes never leaving hers. Diesel whined, but didn't throw himself at the bars. He understood, in his own way, that the wrong reaction right now would be used to condemn them both. The guard placed a hand on Rachel's arm. Right at that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the end of the hall. A young IT tech appeared, his face pale, clutching a two-way radio. He looked at Rachel, then at Doctor. Lang, as if he had just walked in on something he wasn't supposed to see. "Dr. Lang?" he stammered. "IT just called down. There's an issue with the secondary camera system near Bay 3. The atmosphere in the room flipped instantly. Marlene snapped her head toward him. The two guards froze. Owen lifted his head. Diesel went dead silent. Dr. Lang didn't look at the tech right away. He looked at Rachel first, his gaze cold and heavy as steel. "What issue?" Marlene asked. The tech swallowed hard. Someone requested a data lockdown for that zone, but the backup feed was still running. Rachel felt her heart skip a beat. She didn't know who had discovered it, nor did she know how much data was actually left. But she knew one thing for certain. The secondary camera wasn't completely dead. The truth hadn't been fully buried yet. "Doctor," Lang took a step forward, dropping his voice to a dangerous register. "You should be very careful with what you say regarding a situation under active internal investigation." The tech shut his mouth instantly, but it was too late. Everyone in the room had heard it. Rachel slowly pulled her hand away from the crate, not in surrender, but because the order to take Diesel had just lost its absolute authority. She looked at Dr. Lang, then at Marlene. "Now," she said, "perhaps we should hold off on any decisions until that data is properly secured." Dr. Lang took another step toward her. For the first time all night, he didn't bother hiding his fury. "You just destroyed your own career, Nurse Adams." Rachel felt that familiar spike of fear return, but this time, it didn't stand alone. Beside it were Owen's eyes, Diesel's breath, and a jagged piece of the truth finally clawing its way out of the dark. She stood a little taller. "If you want to take Diesel away to bury the truth," Rachel said, enunciating every word clearly in the sterile, freezing room, "you're going to have to go through me first." No one dared to breathe for the next few seconds. Then, Marlene's radio crackled. A stern male voice broadcast over the small speaker, a voice that did not belong to hospital security. "This is Colonel James Whitaker with the Veteran K-9 Support Program. I am in the main lobby. No one is to move the service dog named Diesel until I get up there." Dr. Lang stood paralyzed. Marlene turned ash white. Owen closed his eyes, looking as if he had just heard a prison cell door click open. And Rachel, standing under the harsh white lights amidst the sharp smell of antiseptic, knew she hadn't won yet. But she had held the first line. Diesel was staying. Marlene's radio crackled again, the static slight but enough to render the entire ER dead silent. "I repeat, this is Colonel James Whitaker with the Veteran K-9 Support Program. No one is to move the service dog named Diesel until I personally assess the condition of the animal and his handler." For a few seconds, nobody moved a muscle. The metal crate remained in the middle of the hallway, its wheels blocked right at the toes of Rachel's shoes. Inside, Diesel stood with his snout near the bars, his dark brown eyes shifting from Rachel to the end of the hall, as if he, too, sensed that something had just shifted. Owen lay on the gurney, one wrist still restrained, his breathing heavy but no longer shattering. His eyes were wide, fixed on the sound of the radio, like a man who had just heard a voice calling from outside a room he'd been locked in for far too long. "Doctor." Victor Lang was the first to find his voice. "This is an emergency treatment area of a private hospital," he said to Marlene, though his eyes were locked on Rachel. "No military officer has the authority to walk in here and issue orders during an ongoing medical situation." Marlene didn't answer immediately. Her grip on the radio stiffened. Her face lacked the certainty it had held just minutes ago. She was used to taking orders from doctors, floor managers, legal departments, and men in suits during board meetings. But the voice that had just spoken didn't belong to that familiar system. It carried a different kind of weight. Military, federal programs, veterans, service K-9s, words that could make a hospital obsessed with its public image pause and reconsider. Rachel stayed quiet. She knew this was a dangerous moment. If she gloated, Dr. Lang would paint her as an instigator. If she stayed silent for too long, he would seize control again. So, she simply stood her ground next to Diesel's crate, her hand resting lightly on the cold metal frame, a silent reminder that the boundary she had drawn was still there. From the main lobby, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed, not the frantic running of a panicked patient, nor the soft squeak of nursing shoes. It was a firm, steady cadence, the stride of someone accustomed to commanding a room without having to rush. A tall man appeared at the end of the corridor, sharply dressed in a military uniform, his silver-streaked hair cut short, his face etched with the deep, tired lines of someone who had seen far too much beyond the battlefield. The name tape on his chest read, Whitaker. Beside him walked a woman in a dark navy suit, clutching a portfolio stamped with the Department of Veterans Affairs seal. She didn't speak, but the way she scanned the hallway made several staff members instinctively stand a little straighter. Colonel James Whitaker stopped in front of Diesel's crate. The K-9 looked up at him. His body remained taut, but his breathing shifted ever so slightly. Not total submission, but not defiance either. He recognized the scent of someone who had been around the military. He recognized the way a human could stand before a K-9 without trying to dominate it. Colonel Whitaker lowered his gaze to Diesel, then spoke a short, deep, and clear command. "Easy, boy." Diesel didn't sit, but he stopped pressing his snout against the bars. His ears lowered a fraction. Inside Bay 3, Rachel saw Owen close his eyes, as if the sheer tone of that voice alone was enough to push the battlefield memories a half step back. "Doctor." Lang stepped forward. "Colonel, I respect the military, but you are interfering with a hospital's medical decisions. Patient Miller assaulted me, and this dog, Service K-9. Whitaker interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, and precisely because it wasn't loud, it carried even more authority. Dr. Lang halted. Whitaker turned to him. "His name is Diesel. He is not a disruptive piece of property. He is not a wild animal, and he is not a piece of evidence to be swept off the scene for the sake of a convenient report. According to our program's affiliated records, Diesel is a registered service K-9 assigned to a handler with combat-related PTSD. To separate him from Owen Miller during an active crisis, this hospital must have an independent behavioral assessment and specific medical justification. A one-sided statement is not enough." For the first time all night, Dr. Lang had no immediate retort. Rachel felt a knot in her chest loosen, but she refused to let her guard down. Diesel was still in the crate. Owen was still flagged as violent. The secondary camera footage could still be wiped if she looked away for too long. The woman from the VA stepped up beside Whitaker. "I'm Dana Holloway, liaison for the Department of Veterans Affairs, Nevada region. We received a tip about an incident involving a veteran and his service, K-9, and a potential improper separation protocol. As of this moment, all camera footage, nursing reports, medication logs, and security notes pertaining to Owen Miller are to be preserved." Marlene paled another shade. Dr. Lang gave a thin, humorless smile. "Who called you?" No one answered right away. In the background, the young IT tech stood huddled near the nurse's station, his eyes glued to the floor. Rachel recognized him. Noah Reed, the night shift tech, the same guy who had just announced that the backup feed for the secondary camera was still running. He was shaking so badly, his hands were white-knuckling his radio, but he stood his ground. He didn't run away. Whitaker shot Noah a brief glance, then turned back to Dr. Lang. "The important thing isn't who called. The important thing is why someone felt the need to call from inside this very hospital." That sentence struck the hallway like a sledgehammer. A few nurses exchanged looks. A resident looked down and pretended to adjust a chart, his hand lingering far too long on the page. The atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just Rachel against Dr. Lang. An outside force had stepped in, and their presence made the silently compliant staff begin to realize that their silence was being noticed. Whitaker stepped into Bay 3. Rachel followed, keeping a respectful distance. Owen lay on the bed, his eyes locked on the colonel. As Whitaker approached, Owen tried to push himself up by his shoulders. The restraint yanked against his wrist. He winced. Whitaker didn't tell him to calm down the way an outsider would. He stood where Owen could clearly see both of his hands, then greeted him with a solemn nod. "Sergeant Miller." Owen trembled. Not from fear, because that title once again restored the humanity that this room had tried so desperately to erase. "Sir," Owen rasped, the word barely a whisper. Whitaker looked at the restraint on his wrist, noted the faint bruising around it, and then glanced back at Diesel in the crate by the door. Without needing to ask, he had seen enough to know this situation was nowhere near as clean as the initial report claimed. "Are you still aware of who I am?" Whitaker asked. Owen swallowed hard. "Colonel Whitaker, K-9 Veteran Program, Fort Carson Conference." 3 years ago. Marlene snapped her head up. Rachel froze too. Owen wasn't just lucid. He remembered a specific event and a specific person, all while the entire hospital was documenting him as severely out of control. Whitaker nodded very slowly. Then you're coherent enough that no one is allowed to write your truth for you. Dr. Lang immediately stepped in. Moments of lucidity do not negate the risk of violence. He assaulted me. Whitaker turned back to look at him. I haven't concluded anything, doctor. But what I do see is a patient with a service K9 forcibly separated from his anchor, a secondary camera suddenly reporting issues, and a night shift nurse stepping up to demand data preservation before the file is locked down to the detriment of a veteran. That is more than enough to halt any irreversible decisions. Rachel felt Dr. Lang's gaze sweep over her, cold, sharp, and promising retaliation. Dana Holloway opened her portfolio and pulled out a stack of papers. Furthermore, Owen Miller is not a standard patient within the VA system. Mr. Miller is a primary plaintiff in an active lawsuit, currently being escalated to the federal level, involving Patriot Meridian Health Systems. The room went dead silent. That company name was no longer just a logo hanging in the lobby. It had just become a massive piece of truth, dropped squarely in the middle of the room. Marlene whispered, Patriot Meridian is a corporate sponsor of this hospital. We are aware. Dana replied. Owen closed his eyes. His jaw clenched tight, as if hearing that name alone was enough to drag him back through months of being ignored. Shuffled between clinics, pressured to sign forms, and being told he was misremembering things that he was too unstable to testify. Rachel looked at him, then at Diesel. Everything began to take shape. If Owen was the plaintiff in a lawsuit against a medical contractor tied to the hospital, then labeling him as violent right here in the ER was no simple incident. If Diesel was taken away, Owen would lose his anchor. If Owen broke down, his testimony would easily be discredited. And if a secondary camera was conveniently covered up, someone knew exactly what narrative they needed to control in advance. Whitaker looked at Dr. Lang. Now, I'd like to ask a very simple question. Before the altercation broke out, did anyone ask Owen Miller to sign any legal documents? Not a single person in the room dared to breathe. Dr. Lang maintained his composure, but this time Rachel clearly saw a small vein throbbing at his temple. That is a question for the legal department, he replied. No, Whitaker said. That is a question for the man standing in an emergency room with a torn coat and a patient strapped to a bed. The silence that followed left Dr. Lang nowhere to hide behind his clinical jargon. Owen opened his eyes. He looked at Rachel first, then at Whitaker. His lips trembled, but this time he fought to speak more clearly. He told me to sign, before the tray fell. Dana Holloway immediately noted it down. Dr. Lang took a half step forward. Diesel instantly let out a low growl from the door. Whitaker raised his hand, not toward Diesel, but signaling Dr. Lang to stop. That's enough, he said. Those two words stopped the entire room. Rachel looked at Colonel Whitaker and understood exactly why his arrival terrified Dr. Lang. It wasn't because he could yell louder. It was because he represented something the hospital couldn't control. An external record, a different chain of command, a truth that didn't live on Silver Cross's internal servers. Whitaker turned to Rachel. Are you the nurse who demanded they keep Diesel here? Yes. What did you see? Rachel knew this answer could decide everything. She didn't ramble. She hit every point clearly. Owen's defensive reaction, how Diesel shielded him rather than attacking, the suspiciously neat tear on Dr. Lang's coat, the secondary camera near the air vent, and how Owen had pointed to the ceiling before confirming someone had covered it. No one interrupted her. When she finished, Whitaker looked at Dana. Preserve the data immediately. Dana turned to Noah. Take me to the server room. Noah swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Lang watched them go. For the first time all night, the arrogance on his face didn't entirely vanish, but it cracked. A thin fissure, but enough for Rachel to see that the man standing before her wasn't just angry anymore. He was calculating an exit strategy. Whitaker stepped out the door and stopped next to Diesel's crate. He looked at the two guards. Unlock the crate. Marlene jumped. Colonel, the hospital hasn't... He's not roaming free in the ER, Whitaker said. Move him into Bay 3. controlled, right next to his handler. That is a stabilization measure, not a risk. Rachel saw Owen shut his eyes tightly, as if fighting back tears in front of a crowded room. When the crate door opened, Diesel didn't bolt out. He stepped down slowly, walking straight toward Owen's bed. Rachel stood close by to assist if needed, but Diesel didn't need anyone to guide him. He walked right up to the bed and rested his head on the edge of the mattress, right next to Owen's free hand. Owen touched the dog's head with trembling fingers. Nobody in the room said a word. Nobody needed to. In that moment, all accusations of a rabid, vicious dog were rendered completely hollow. Diesel didn't bite. He didn't attack. He didn't cause chaos. He simply stood by his soldier, doing exactly the job he had been trained to do, keeping him anchored to the present. Are you feeling the satisfaction of watching the bad guy start to sweat? Drop a justice in the comments if you're standing with Rachel, Owen, and Diesel in this fight. But Rachel didn't let herself believe it was all over just yet. Dr. Lang was too quiet. A man like him wouldn't just fold because a colonel showed up or a VA liaison opened a file. He had lost control of this room, and that exact fact made him far more dangerous. Down the hall, as Dana and Noah headed toward the IT room, Dr. Lang quietly slipped his hand into his coat pocket. His thumb traced the screen of his phone. Rachel only caught the movement out of the corner of her eye for a split second, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. The door to justice had just cracked open, but the villain still had one more ruthless move left to play. The phone in Dr. Victor Lang's white coat pocket lit up for only a brief second, but Rachel Adams caught it. He didn't answer it, didn't say a word. He just glanced down at the screen, swiped his thumb over a message, and put the phone away, as if it were a meaningless gesture amid the chaos of the shift. But the anger on his face from moments ago was gone. In its place was a different kind of calm. Colder, more guarded, like a door shutting behind a decision that couldn't be unmade. Rachel knew that kind of calm. It wasn't the calm of an innocent man. It was the calm of someone who had just shifted from defense to offense. Inside Bay 3, Diesel was lying next to Owen's bed, his head resting near the trembling hand of the former Marine. Colonel Whitaker stood near the door. Dana Holloway and Noah Reed had left for the server room to secure the secondary camera footage. For the first time since the stainless steel tray hit the floor, Owen didn't look entirely submerged in a panic attack. The heart rate on the monitor was still high, but it was no longer in a chaotic freefall. His fingers were buried in the thick fur on Diesel's head, clinging to it like the very last edge of reality. Rachel should have felt relieved, but she didn't, because Dr. Lang was entirely too quiet. He walked out of Bay 3, passing Marlene Price without a word. As he walked past Rachel, he stopped just long enough for her to hear his lowered voice. "You think you just saved them?" Rachel stared straight back at him. Dr. Lang tilted his head slightly, a smile so thin it barely existed. "You've only just made yourself the primary problem." Then he walked away. No loud threats. No explosive anger. Just a quiet sentence delivered amidst the smell of antiseptic and harsh white lights. But it made Rachel run colder than any shouting could. 15 minutes later, her employee badge was deactivated. Rachel found out when she tried to open the auxiliary med cabinet to get soft wraps for Owen's wrists. The scanner let out a glaring red beep. A message flashed on the small screen. Access denied. Contact administration. She tried again. Still a red beep. A young nurse standing nearby looked at her, then immediately looked down at a chart as if she'd seen nothing. Rachel didn't blame her. In this hospital, fear spread faster than any infection. Marlene walked over, her face rigid. "Rachel, your system access has been temporarily suspended. On what grounds?" "Administration reported an unauthorized access to Owen Miller's electronic file using your credentials." Rachel felt the air around her freeze. "I haven't opened his EMR since I was called into the conference room. I'm just passing on the notice." "You know this is a setup." Marlene looked at her. Something akin to pain flickered in her eyes, but it vanished too fast. "I know that you need to be careful right now." That answer spoke louder than any confession. Rachel turned back toward Bay 3. Owen was watching her through the gap in the curtain, while Diesel lifted his head as if sensing the shift in her breathing. Rachel forced a very faint smile for them, not because things were okay, but because Owen couldn't handle another crisis right now. But the second blow landed even faster. On the TV screen mounted in the ER waiting area, the local midnight news flashed a scrolling chyron at the bottom. Nurse suspended after K-9 incident at Las Vegas hospital. Rachel's face appeared in an old ID photo pulled from the Silver Cross staff directory, right next to blurry footage of a K-9 crate being rolled down a hallway. The reporter stated in a grave tone that a nurse had been suspended after interfering with the emergency treatment of a violent veteran patient. No mention of Owen's name, none of Rachel's words, no secondary camera, no Diesel lying calmly by his handler's hand. Just a neatly framed narrative. The hospital took action to protect public safety. A patient in the waiting area looked up at the screen, then turned to look at Rachel. The gaze wasn't malicious, it was just suspicious. But sometimes, the suspicion of a stranger is enough to make your skin crawl. Rachel's phone buzzed. It was her mom. Rachel stared at Mom on the screen but didn't pick up. She couldn't explain to her mother that her daughter had just been turned into a cautionary tale on the midnight news. She couldn't say that all she had done was stand in front of a crate to protect a voiceless dog and a soldier no one believed anymore. She silenced the ringer. Across the hall, Dr. Lang stood by a glass door, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't looking at Rachel, but she knew he saw everything. Saw her locked out of the system. Saw the news breaking on the TV. Saw her colleagues starting to avert their eyes. Saw how a person could be systematically isolated right in the middle of a crowded room. This was the revenge of those in power. No need to strike directly, just make everyone terrified to stand near her. Colonel Whitaker walked over after catching sight of the broadcast. His face darkened. "Miss Adams," he said quietly, "do you still have any notes from before you were locked out of the system?" Rachel nodded. "My nursing notepad is in my pocket. And I have the secondary camera in my memory, though I didn't get a chance to take a picture. Do not hand that notepad over to anyone employed by this hospital without a VA representative or a lawyer present." That statement made Rachel realize the severity had escalated far beyond a simple shift dispute. This was no longer an argument between a nurse and a doctor. This was a war for control over the evidence. From the direction of the server room, Noah Reed came running back, his face ashen. Dana Holloway followed him, phone in hand, her expression terrifyingly cold. "The backup data is still there," Noah panted to Whitaker. "But there's an override command coming from a high-level admin account. If we don't back it up right now, it will be wiped within minutes." Dana looked at Rachel. "Do you know who has that level of admin clearance on the night shift?" Rachel turned toward the end of the hall. Dr. Lang was gone. At that exact moment, the lights in Bay 3 flickered. Owen's monitor glitched briefly, then returned to normal. Diesel instantly shot to his feet, letting out a low growl. Owen opened his eyes, his breathing rapidly accelerating. Rachel sprinted into the room. "It's okay," she said immediately, keeping her voice even. "Owen, look at me. You're at Silver Cross. Diesel is right here." No one is taking him. But Owen wasn't looking at her. He was staring up at the monitor, then at his IV line, as if everything around him had morphed back into a trap. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His shoulders tensed. His hand clawed into Diesel's fur. The K-9 pressed his entire body against the edge of the mattress, leaning into Owen's leg to keep him grounded. Rachel wanted to check the meds, but her badge was locked. She wanted to call for another nurse. But the ones outside the door were hesitating because her name had just flashed on the news. A wave of helplessness stabbed at her chest. Doctor. Lang wasn't just attacking her reputation. He was weaponizing her isolation to destabilize Owen. Marlene walked in, holding a syringe. The doctor ordered a prophylactic sedative. Rachel spun around. "Which doctor ordered that?" Marlene didn't answer. "Dr. Lang left the floor," Rachel said. "What time was that order entered?" Marlene looked at the syringe in her hand, then at Owen. In that moment, her face seemed to age years. Perhaps for the first time, she clearly saw that what she was holding wasn't just a medication, but a cog in the machine grinding down the man on the bed. "Don't do it," Rachel said softly. "You know he's being triggered because the system is being tampered with. Don't turn that reaction into an excuse to lock him down." Marlene gripped the syringe, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Outside the door, Dana shouted, "We need that backup right now." Noah, with me. Noah nodded, but as soon as he turned to go, two hospital security guards blocked his path. One of them stated that the server room was under lockdown per internal administration orders. Colonel Whitaker stepped forward, his voice dropping into a deep register. "Step aside. Sir, this is a restricted hospital area, and that data now pertains to a veteran under VA jurisdiction. Step aside." The air in the hallway pulled as taut as a steel cable. Rachel stood caught between two fronts. Outside, the tug-of-war over the camera footage. Inside, Owen trying desperately not to break. Diesel was pressed tight against him, his eyes glued to the door. Every breath the dog took felt like a silent command. Hold him together, hold him together, hold him together. Then, Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. "You should stop if you want your mother in Reno left alone." For a second, the entire room seemed to vanish. Rachel stared at the words, her hands turning ice cold. This wasn't just a suspension anymore. It wasn't just a smear campaign on the news. They had found her family. They wanted to drag the terror out of the hospital and plant it into the small house where her mother was sleeping, where that old woman might wake up to a malicious phone call, a strange car parked out front, an unsigned threat. Rachel felt her knees want to buckle. She stepped out of Bay 3 and moved into a corner of the hallway near the vending machines, where the lighting was dimmer. The smell of burnt coffee from the machine mixing with the antiseptic made her nauseous. On the TV screen, the broadcast was still looping her face. On her phone, the threatening text still glowed like an open wound. This was the darkest part, the part she had never prepared for. She had thought she might lose her job. She had thought she might get a disciplinary write-up. But she hadn't thought about her mother. She hadn't thought that a healthcare system cloaked in humanitarianism could reach outside the hospital to strangle the family of a subordinate nurse. She closed her eyes. In the brief darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her father sitting at the kitchen table years ago, Mason lying at his feet, his hands trembling around a cold mug of coffee. She heard that old saying of his again. The people protecting a lie aren't afraid of the truth. They're afraid of the person brave enough to see it through to the end. When Rachel opened her eyes, they were wet. But she was no longer lost. She walked back to Bay 3. Owen was looking at her, even though he was the one in the hospital bed. Diesel was looking at her too, his head resting on the edge of the mattress, his dark brown eyes asking for nothing, demanding nothing, just being there. Rachel stepped up next to Owen and reached down to grab her personal bag from under the chair. She pulled out her nursing notepad, her phone, and the small pen she had used to document every symptom she had seen since the shift began. Marlene stood at the door, the syringe still in her hand, unused. Rachel looked at her. "If you still believe in the oath you took, do not push that med without an independent evaluation." Marlene didn't reply, but she lowered the syringe. It wasn't a victory, just a sliver of light. Rachel turned to Colonel Whitaker and Dana Holloway out in the hall. "They just threatened my mother." Whitaker looked at her, his expression altering instantly. It was no longer just administrative concern. It was the face of a soldier confirming the enemy had just crossed the line of departure. Dana spoke curtly. "Forward that message to me. Right now." "That is whistleblower intimidation." Rachel forwarded the text. Her hands were still shaking, but this time she didn't try to hide it. Dr. Lang wanted her to be so terrified that she would back down. And she was terrified. Terrified to the bone. But as Rachel looked at Owen and Diesel, she understood that her fear couldn't possibly outweigh the price they would pay if she stayed silent. She stood in the middle of the hallway, beneath the glaring white lights of Silver Cross, with her reputation smeared on the TV, her access locked, her family threatened, and her career dangling over a fabricated report. But the fire in her eyes didn't go out. From that moment on, Rachel Adams was no longer just trying to save Diesel from being taken away, or save Owen from a bad injection. She had seen the true face of the system stacked against her, and she decided she wasn't taking another step back. The threatening text about Rachel's mother shifted the entire landscape of the night. Before that, the hospital could still spin the incident as an internal dispute, a misunderstood emergency protocol, or an overly emotional nurse siding with a patient. But when the words, "You should stop if you want your mother in Reno left alone," appeared on her phone, the truth crossed the hospital's boundaries. It was no longer a professional disagreement. It was witness intimidation. Dana Holloway took a screenshot, forwarded it to a contact at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and instructed Rachel not to delete anything. Colonel Whitaker stood near Bay 3, his face like stone. He didn't say much, but his sheer silence made the two security guards who had just blocked Noah Reed step half a pace back. "Now," Dana said, her voice low but sharp, "we preserve the evidence. No one leaves the camera feeds. No one alters the charts. No one touches Diesel or Owen Miller without an independent witness present." Marlene Price was still standing in the doorway, the syringe of sedative lowered at her side. Her eyes were no longer those of a charge nurse defending hospital protocol. They were the eyes of someone who had just seen the protocol she believed in wielded like a knife. Rachel looked at her but said nothing. There are moments when a person has to listen to their own conscience. No one else can speak for them. Noah led Dana and Colonel Whitaker to the IT server room. Rachel followed, her hand still gripping the small nursing notepad in her pocket. She knew she was wading deeper into the danger zone. Her access was locked. Her face was on the news. Her mother had been threatened, but none of those things could drag her backward anymore. When a system resorts to threatening a nurse's family to keep a video feed quiet, it means that feed carries more weight than all their excuses combined. The IT room was at the end of the service corridor, behind a windowless metal door. Inside, it was hotter than the ER, the servers humming continuously. Red and green lights blinked across the hard drive racks. Surveillance monitors hung in a row, displaying various angles of the hospital. The main lobby, the reception desk, the ER hallway, the ambulance bay. It all looked chillingly normal. A clean, well-lit, punctual facility, while underneath it all, the truth was being dragged into a digital trash bin minute by minute. Noah sat down at the console. His hands were shaking so badly he typed his password wrong the first time. "Take a breath," Rachel said softly. Noah glanced at her, his eyes red with fear. "I'm seeing an override command. It's not automated. Someone is using an admin-level account to delete the data segment matching the exact time frame of the incident." "Can you back it up?" Dana asked. "It's running on the secondary camera's cache memory. If I extract it right now, I might be able to save a portion of it." Colonel Whitaker stood behind Noah, his massive frame blocking out most of the overhead light. "Do it." Noah plugged an external drive into the terminal. A progress bar crawled across the screen. 2%, 5%, 9%. Every number ticked up like a prolonged heartbeat. Rachel stared at the screen, the whir of the server fans buzzing in her ears, feeling like she was standing in front of a paper-thin door. On the other side was whatever Dr. Lang was trying to hide. On this side was everything he had done to stop them from opening it. When the progress bar hit 37%, the screen flickered. Noah cursed under his breath. "There's a remote kill command." Dana immediately slammed her phone onto the desk and put it on speaker. "I need an emergency evidence preservation order for Silver Cross Medical Center. Involved veteran, Owen Miller. Signs of camera data tampering and witness intimidation." On the other end of the line, a stern male voice asked for confirmation details. Dana answered each question sharply and concisely, like someone used to shoving the truth through bureaucratic doors before they could be slammed shut. Rachel heard the phrases "federal preservation notice," "potential witness intimidation," and "VA-linked patient," and understood that the war had just escalated to a whole new level. This was no longer just her against Dr. Lang in an ER hallway. This was evidence against an entire network. The progress bar froze at 54%, then 55%, 56%. Noah leaned close to the screen. "I've got visual." The room went dead silent. On a secondary monitor, the soundless video feed began to play. The footage was slightly grainy, angled downward from near the air vent, but clear enough to show Bay 3 right before the tray hit the floor. Owen was sitting on the bed, holding Diesel's leash with one hand. Dr. Lang stood in front of him, holding out a stack of papers. Owen shook his head. "Doctor." Lang said something, pointing at Diesel. Owen gripped the leash tighter. Diesel stood up, angling his body between his handler and the doctor. Then, Dr. Lang stepped too close. Owen recoiled on the bed. "Doctor!" Lang grabbed his wrist. Rachel felt her hands turn ice cold. In the video, Owen yanked his arm back reflexively. Doctor. Lang immediately struck him hard on the shoulder, not a defensive maneuver, but a blow designed to trigger a reaction. Diesel barked and lunged forward to shield him, but Owen pulled the leash tight, holding the dog back. Dr. Lang backed away, glanced up at the secondary camera. Then he reached over to a supply cart and picked up something small and gleaming. A medical scalpel. He sliced the shoulder of his own white coat. No one in the server room said a word. The hum of the cooling fan sounded unusually loud. Rachel stared at the monitor, her stomach churning. Everything Owen had tried to say, everything Diesel had tried to warn them about it was all right there, in soundless images that rang out like a bell of judgment. Noah fast-forwarded a few seconds. Doctor, Lang swept the stainless steel tray onto the floor. When the first responders rushed in, he pointed at Owen, then pointed at Diesel. From that exact moment, the fabricated narrative began, swallowed whole by the hospital as fact. Dana spoke very quietly. Back this copy up. 3 versions. 1 to the VA system, 1 to the external drive, and 1 encrypted copy to the lawyer. Which lawyer? Rachel asked. Dana looked at her. From now on, you need your own counsel. Not just for Owen. For you. 20 minutes later, Rachel was sitting in a small break room next to the IT department. A video call open on Noah's laptop. On the screen was Evelyn Brooks, a former JAG Corps attorney who now specialized in defending veterans and medical whistleblowers. She was in Washington, D.C., but her eyes were so sharp it felt like she was standing right in the room. Evelyn listened to Dana's summary, watched the video clip, read the screenshot of the threatening text, and sat in silence for a few seconds. As of right now, she said, Rachel Adams is a witness and potential whistleblower in a case involving the tampering of a veteran patient's medical records. Do not sign any hospital documents. Do not hand your notepad over to management. Do not answer any internal interview questions without me or a VA representative present. And Owen Miller needs to be moved to medical protective status, not disciplinary isolation. Rachel listened, her insides still trembling. They put my face on the news. Good, Evelyn replied. Rachel froze. Good, because they played their hand too early, Evelyn continued. A public smear campaign before an investigation is even complete shows they're trying to control the narrative. Combined with the text threatening your family and the data deletion order, we have a pattern of whistleblower retaliation. A pattern. That word sent a chill down Rachel's spine. It wasn't the spontaneous act of an exposed doctor. It wasn't just a few panicked decisions made in the middle of the night. A pattern meant structure. It meant someone knew exactly how to do this. Someone who had done it before. Dana placed a file folder on the table. Patriot Meridian Health Systems has had complaints filed in 3 states. Veterans reporting being coerced into signing liability waivers following treatment complications. Several of those files were later flagged, labeling the patients as mentally unstable or uncooperative. Rachel looked at the names in the file. Every line was another human being turned into an adverse clinical note. Some had service dogs. Some lived alone. Some had died before their appeals were reopened. The room felt like it was shrinking. Owen wasn't an isolated case. Diesel hadn't just protected his handler from a doctor during a chaotic night shift. He had accidentally snagged the loose thread of a network that had operated for far too long on the pain and silence of returning soldiers. Evelyn spoke up. Dr. Lang is the direct link. But the bigger question is who inside Silver Cross knew what he was doing, and who at Patriot Meridian benefits from discrediting plaintiffs like Owen. Rachel thought of Marlene, of the legal department, of the news broadcast that aired way too fast, of the admin account ordering the camera overwrite. Each puzzle piece tumbled down like a rock slide, revealing an even darker layer underneath. The break room door opened. Marlene stood outside. She didn't step in right away. Her face was ashen, her hands tightly gripping a stack of papers. Rachel looked at her, unsure whether to brace for a new order or a belated collapse. Marlene set the stack of papers on the table. I didn't know the whole truth, she rasped, but I knew files were being flagged incorrectly. Not just Owen's. I've seen notes added after patients refused to sign waivers. I kept telling myself it was a legal issue, not a nursing one. No one interrupted her. Marlene looked at Rachel. In her eyes was the naked shame of someone who had stayed silent for far too long. I kept printouts of 3 files. I was too afraid to do anything with them. But tonight, when they told me to push the sedative on Owen, I knew I had gone too far. Rachel looked at the papers. This wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was another door swinging open. Evelyn spoke immediately from the screen. Hand those over to Dana. We're establishing a chain of custody. Marlene nodded, tears spilling over silently. I'm sorry. Rachel didn't know how to respond. She was still angry. She still remembered Marlene telling her to stand down, telling her to stay quiet, telling her to trust the protocol. But she also understood that in a war against a system, sometimes the truth needs terrified people to turn around right at the breaking point. Help us protect Owen, Rachel said. Then you can apologize to him. Marlene nodded again. Out in the hallway, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed. Noah pulled up the security feed on the secondary monitor. Doctor. Lang was briskly walking toward the employee parking garage, his phone pressed to his ear. Dana immediately called the federal security officers accompanying the VA to block the exits. Colonel Whitaker left the room without a word. Rachel stood up, but Evelyn called out to her. Rachel, she turned back to the screen. You did the right thing. But from now on, they won't target Owen first. They're going to target your credibility, your license, your family, your past. You need to be ready. Rachel looked down at the nursing notepad in her hand. The scrawled notes documenting the torn coat, Diesel's eyes, the bruise on Owen's wrist, the secondary camera, the exact time her badge was locked out. A flimsy little notepad, but tonight it carried the weight of an oath. I'm scared, she admitted honestly. Evelyn nodded. Good. People who aren't scared usually don't understand what they're up against. Just don't let the fear make your decisions for you. Rachel stepped out into the hallway. Back in Bay 3, Owen was sitting up a little higher, Diesel lying right next to the bed with his head resting on Owen's leg. When Owen saw Rachel, he didn't ask what she had found. He probably saw the answer on her face. Is the camera footage still there? He asked. Rachel stepped closer, resting her hand on the bedrail. It is, and it shows that you were telling the truth. Owen closed his eyes. It wasn't total relief. A man whose voice has been stolen for far too long can't find peace in a single sentence. But his shoulders dropped, and his hand buried itself deeper into Diesel's fur. So, they'll listen to me now? Rachel looked out into the hallway, where Dana was locking down the evidence, where Colonel Whitaker was marching out to intercept Dr. Lang, where Marlene had finally surrendered the files she'd kept hidden. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be clean. The hospital would fight back. Patriot Meridian would deny everything. The media had already been fed the wrong story. But for the first time, the truth didn't just live in the hoarse throat of a former Marine and the eyes of a caged K-9. It had footage. It had witnesses. It had a lawyer. It had paper trails. It had people willing to drag it out into the light. Rachel looked at Owen and spoke slowly, as firm as a promise. This time, they don't get to write your story for you. The hearing took place 3 weeks later at the Clark County Courthouse, inside a cavernous room with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and packed gallery benches. Outside the courthouse, news vans were lined up baking in the Las Vegas sun. The American flag whipped in the dry wind atop the tall flagpole in the courtyard. Veterans wearing their unit jackets stood in a silent vigil on the steps. Some leaned on canes, some sat in wheelchairs, and some stood alongside their service dogs. Nobody shouted or chanted. It was their very silence that gave the scene its gravity. They didn't come to watch a hospital scandal unfold. They came to witness whether a soldier like Owen Miller still had the right to speak the truth against a system that had tried to brand him as unhinged. Rachel Adams sat in the witness gallery, her hands resting on her old nursing notepad. She wasn't wearing scrubs. Evelyn Brooks had advised her to wear a simple, dark suit, no flashy jewelry, nothing that could allow the media to spin her into anything other than what she was, a nurse who had upheld her oath. But even dressed in the gray blazer, Rachel still felt like she was standing in the middle of the ER that night, under the glaring white lights, one hand resting on Diesel's metal crate, facing Dr. Lang and a dead silent hallway. On the other side of the room, Dr. Victor Lang sat with Silver Cross's legal team and the representatives from Patriot Meridian Health Systems. His white coat was gone, replaced by an expensive tailored suit. The tear on his shoulder from that night was now just a photograph in an evidence file, but his eyes remained exactly the same. Cold, calculating, and waiting for an opportunity to turn everyone else into the problem. Owen Miller walked in a few minutes after Rachel. The room practically held its breath. He wore a crisp white shirt and a dark navy jacket, the faint marks of the restraints still visible around his wrists. Diesel walked at his left side, the leash hanging loose in Owen's hand, wearing a neat service dog vest with a small patch indicating his K9 veteran program. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't pull on the leash. He walked with an even, dignified stride, his head held high, before lying down quietly at Owen's feet as he took his seat in the witness waiting area. Rachel watched them, her eyes stinging. 3 weeks ago, Diesel was labeled a hazard, locked in a cage, and waiting to be hauled off by animal control. Now, he lay in the middle of a county courthouse, far more peaceful and dignified than many of the humans who had condemned him. The administrative judge banged the gavel. The hearing commenced. The hospital's representative spoke first. His voice was smooth and professional, his statement crafted so meticulously that every word sounded like it had been run through the legal department a dozen times. He spoke about staff safety, emergency protocols, PTSD patients exhibiting erratic responses, and the difficult balance between compassion and hospital security. He didn't call Rachel a liar. He merely stated she had exceeded the scope of her clinical role. He didn't call Owen dangerous. He merely noted his history of volatile reactions. He didn't call Diesel a monster. He simply said that animals in an emergency environment must be strictly managed. Rachel listened, her stomach turning. The most dangerous lie isn't a blunt falsehood. It's a lie dressed up in the clothes of reason. Then it was Evelyn Brooks's turn to stand. She didn't rush to play the video. She didn't rush to attack. She walked to the center of the room, placed a thin file folder on the podium, and spoke in a steady, unshakable tone. This incident didn't start with an aggressive dog. It started with a vulnerable veteran patient being pressured to sign away his right to litigate. It didn't escalate because a nurse broke protocol. It escalated because the only nurse in the room looked closely enough to realize the protocol was being weaponized. A hush fell over the courtroom. Evelyn called Rachel to the stand first. Rachel walked up to the witness chair. The wood beneath her hands was colder than she expected. After she was sworn in, she looked up and saw dozens of eyes staring at her. Lawyers, journalists, veterans, former hospital colleagues, and her mother, sitting in the very back row with her hands tightly clutching a tissue. Rachel took a breath, remembering Evelyn's advice. Don't try to win with emotion. Speak the facts. She recounted the clatter of the stainless steel tray, the suspiciously clean tear on Dr. Lang's coat, the way Owen reacted when approached from behind, and how Diesel didn't lunge at the crowd but stood as a shield for his handler. She talked about the command, "Stand down, Marine," and the exact moment the K9 stopped. She testified about the secondary camera, the black electrical tape, and how her badge access was revoked immediately after she requested the evidence be preserved. The hospital's lawyer objected multiple times, but Evelyn expertly navigated it, letting Rachel answer every question in a clear, unwavering voice. No exaggerations, no vindictiveness, no embellishing what she hadn't seen. It was that exact composure that gave her testimony such devastating weight. "Do you harbor a personal hatred for Dr. Lang?" the hospital's lawyer asked. Rachel glanced over at him. "Doctor." Lang sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. "I don't need to hate him to know that what I saw was wrong," Rachel replied. "I'm a nurse. My job isn't to protect a doctor's feelings. My job is to protect patients when they no longer have the strength to protect themselves." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery. Next was Noah Reed. The young IT tech was shaking so badly he had to hold his water glass with both hands. But when the system's deletion logs flashed on the monitors, his voice steadied. He explained how an admin account had attempted to overwrite the specific time frame of the incident, how the secondary camera's cache memory had retained the footage, and how the data lockdown was absolutely not an automated system error. Then, Marlene Price was called. Rachel hadn't known if she would actually show up until the moment she stepped forward. Marlene wore a pale blue blouse, her hair still pulled into its signature tight bun, but her face looked years older and bone-tired. She looked at Rachel once before taking the oath. In her eyes was a mix of shame, fear, and a belated but deeply genuine resolve. "I used to just follow what I called the protocol," Marlene testified. "But that night, I knew the protocol was being used to separate a service dog from his handler, and then use the patient's resulting panic as evidence against him." She handed over the physical printouts of 3 other veterans' files, patients who had been flagged as uncooperative after refusing to sign liability waivers. 3 names, 3 stories, 3 human beings reduced to cold clinical notes. The atmosphere in the courtroom completely shifted. The Patriot Meridian representatives began furiously scribbling notes. A lawyer whispered frantically into Dr. Lang's ear, but Dr. Lang kept his face stone cold, until Evelyn spoke again. "We would now like to present the video evidence from the secondary camera in Bay 3. The large screen at the front of the courtroom lit up. There was no sound. Only grainy footage angled downward from the ceiling vent. But the truth didn't need sound to roar. Owen sat on the bed. Diesel stood beside him. Dr. Lang held out a stack of papers. Owen shook his head. "Doctor." Lang stepped closer, pointing aggressively at the dog. Owen backed away. "Doctor." Lang grabbed his wrist. The courtroom was dead silent. In the video, Owen yanked his arm back reflexively. Dr. Lang immediately struck him hard on the shoulder. Diesel lunged forward to shield him but didn't bite. Owen pulled the leash tight, holding the canine back. Dr. Lang backed away, glanced up at the secondary camera, reached over to the supply cart, and picked up a small, gleaming object. A medical scalpel. He sliced the shoulder of his own white coat. No one in the courtroom breathed. The silence was absolute. Rachel heard someone in the back rows let out a soft, stifled sob. Maybe it was Owen's mother. Maybe it was another veteran seeing themselves in that exact moment of being framed as a threat. Evelyn stopped the video. "Here," she said, her voice cutting through the room, "is the exact moment a lie is born." Dr. Lang finally lost his composure. He shot to his feet. "That video lacks context. The patient has a history of 12. "Sit down, Dr. Lang," the judge barked. He didn't sit down immediately, and that brief moment of hesitation prompted 2 court bailiffs to step closer. Evelyn proceeded to lay out the paper trail, the consulting kickbacks from Patriot Meridian into Dr. Lang's shell company, the admin login traces used to order the camera wipe, the threatening text sent to Rachel's phone, and the local news broadcast that aired before any independent investigation had even begun. Each piece of evidence fell like shattered glass, slicing right through the professional veneer Silver Cross had used to hide the rot. Finally, Owen was called to the stand. Diesel stood up with him. The judge allowed the K-9 to accompany him to the witness box. Owen rested his hand on Diesel's head before speaking. His voice was still raspy, but this time, every word was crystal clear. "I didn't attack him. I didn't want to sign that paper. I just wanted to keep Diesel with me, because he's the reason I'm still sitting here today." He paused, looking directly at Dr. Lang. "He knew that, and he used it against me." No one in the courtroom moved. Rachel looked at Owen and saw something that no verdict could ever truly measure. He had gotten his voice back. The judge delivered the ruling: immediate suspension of Dr. Lang's practicing privileges at Silver Cross, with the file referred to a criminal grand jury for battery, medical record falsification, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. Silver Cross was placed under temporary federal oversight regarding its entire veteran care program. Patriot Meridian was ordered to freeze all files related to veteran litigation. As the court bailiffs approached Dr. Lang, he turned to look at Rachel. For the first time, his eyes weren't cold. They were hollow, panicked the eyes of a man realizing that every door he used to own had just been slammed shut. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. Rachel looked at him. She remembered the ER that night. She remembered the metal crate. She remembered the text threatening her mother. She remembered Owen's trembling hand, buried in Diesel's fur. "I know exactly what I did," she said. "I put into the record the very thing you tried to erase." Dr. Lang was escorted out of the courtroom, right into the flashing lenses of the media. There was no cheering. Just the heavy, suffocating silence of people watching a powerful man collapse under the weight of the very evidence he had tried to bury. Owen sat back down, his hands shaking. Diesel rested his massive head on his knee. This time, Owen didn't try to hide his tears. "He saved me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Rachel stood a few steps away. She didn't need to reply. The truth had done its job. And in that sun-drenched Nevada courtroom, the man they had called a threat, the K-9 they had called a monster, and the nurse they had tried to humiliate finally stood together on the exact same side as justice. 3 months after the hearing at the Clark County Courthouse, Silver Cross Medical Center no longer shone the way it once paraded before the public. The Honoring Those Who Served plaque in the main lobby was still there. The American flag still hung beside the veteran tribute wall, but beneath those beautiful symbols lay something the hospital had tried to avoid at all costs: federal oversight. An investigation team was set up in a third-floor conference room. Patriot Meridian Health Systems contracts were frozen. The veteran files previously flagged as uncooperative, unstable, or violent risks were being reopened, one by one. Not every wound heals in 3 months. Some people had lost their trust for too long to walk into a hospital without trembling. Some families received apologies that arrived far too late. Some veterans with falsified records now had to sit before investigators and recount the pain they had been forced to swallow for years. But for the first time, the narrative was no longer being written by those who wanted to bury it. Rachel Adams returned to Silver Cross one last time to finalize her exit paperwork. She walked through the automatic doors on a sunny morning, wearing a navy blue jacket, carrying a small cardboard box containing a few old belongings, a stethoscope, some pens, a dog-eared pocket notebook, and a small name tag that read R. Adams, RN. The staff at the nurses' station looked at her with a mix of expressions. Some lowered their heads in shame. Some offered a quiet nod. Some, who had actively avoided her on the night Owen was condemned, now wanted to say something, but couldn't find words clean enough to bridge the gap. Rachel didn't blame them individually. She had learned that a toxic system isn't just built by loud, malicious people. It survives thanks to good people convincing themselves that silence is the safest way to survive a shift. Marlene Price was waiting for her in the nurses' break room. She no longer had that rigid, wrinkle-free demeanor from that night. Marlene looked older, the gray at her temples much more pronounced. She had submitted her resignation as head nurse and was fully cooperating with the federal investigation. On the table between them sat a small envelope. "I know an apology doesn't fix anything," Marlene said. Rachel set her box down. "No, it doesn't." Marlene bowed her head. She accepted the answer as something she deserved to hear. Rachel looked at the woman who had once told her to sit down, stay quiet, and trust the protocol. Then she remembered the moment Marlene lowered the sedative syringe, the files she had surrendered, the raw shame on her face in the server room. The truth is, people don't always stand on the right side from the very beginning. Sometimes they turn around late. And while a late turnaround doesn't erase past mistakes, it can still save the people who come after. But it can be a starting point, Rachel said. Marlene looked up, her eyes rimmed with red. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter. Marlene had submitted supplemental testimony detailing the times veteran files were altered after they refused to sign waivers. The letter didn't absolve her of her complicity, but it helped 3 other families reopen their cases. Rachel held the letter, feeling its strange weight, light in her hand, heavy in her chest. A week later, Rachel started a new job at a VA-affiliated clinic in suburban Henderson, specializing in PTSD treatment and service dog support. Her new name tag no longer hung beneath the Silver Cross logo. It sat on her familiar dark blue scrubs, right below the words, Veteran Trauma Care Unit. On her first day, she walked into the common room and saw returning soldiers scattered in the afternoon sun. Some didn't speak. Some always sat with their backs to the wall. Some kept a hand resting on the head of the dog beside their chair, clinging to it like an anchor. Rachel didn't look at them as difficult medical files. She looked at each of them as a story that hadn't been told right. In the corner of the room, Owen Miller sat by the window. He looked different. Not fully healed because no one comes back from pain that deep with just one court hearing or an apology. But his posture was straighter. His eyes were no longer constantly searching for the nearest exit. Diesel lay at his feet, wearing a brand new service vest, now bearing a small patch awarded by the veteran K-9 program, Guardian Service Recognition. When he saw Rachel, Owen stood up. Diesel lifted his head, his tail, giving a soft, steady wag. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just a peaceful recognition between people who had walked through the exact same dark night. "Nurse Adams," Owen said. Rachel smiled. "Sergeant Miller." Those two titles were no longer a tactic to pull someone out of a panic attack. They had become an acknowledgement, a nurse, a soldier. Both had been labeled by a system trying to turn them into something else, a troublemaker and a dangerous patient. Now, they stood before each other, using their rightful names. A few weeks later, a new initiative was announced at the Nevada Veterans Memorial Hall. The hall wasn't massive, but that day, it was packed to the brim. American flags flanked the podium. The front rows were filled with veterans, nurses, lawyers, patients' families, and handlers whose service dogs the hospitals had once treated as nuisances. Dana Holloway, representing the VA, read the new policy aloud. Any medical facility receiving veteran care funding in the region must preserve camera data upon any allegation of violence involving a service dog. K9S cannot be separated from their handlers during a PTSD crisis without an independent behavioral assessment, and any decision to sedate following a disputed incident must be overseen by an uninvolved second physician. The press dubbed it the Diesel Protocol. Rachel didn't name it that. Neither did Owen. But as the name was read over the speakers, Diesel was lying at Owen's feet, his snout resting on his front paws, as calm as if he didn't realize the entire room was honoring him. Perhaps he truly didn't need to understand. Dogs like Diesel don't serve to win medals. They serve because when their person falls into the dark, they will follow them down and pull them back into the light. Colonel Whitaker stepped up to the podium and presented Owen with an official commendation, recognizing that Diesel had prevented harm to his handler and helped preserve crucial evidence in a federal investigation. Owen accepted the certificate with both hands. He didn't cry, but Rachel could see his throat working hard to swallow the emotion. Then Whitaker turned to Rachel. "As for Miss Adams," he said, "she proved that bravery in a hospital doesn't always wear a military uniform. Sometimes it wears blue scrubs, stands in front of a metal crate, and says, 'Put it in the chart that I demanded it.'" The entire hall stood up. The applause didn't erupt all at once. It started slow, then swelled, beat by beat, like rain falling on a roof after a very long drought. Rachel stood still, her hands turning cold with emotion. Her mother sat in the second row, tears streaming down her face, but smiling widely. Evelyn Brooks stood in the back, arms crossed, her eyes strict but warm. Marlene Price sat near the rear doors, not seeking attention, just quietly clapping like a person, relearning how to stand on the right side of history. Rachel walked up to accept her commendation from the Nevada veteran community. The piece of paper wasn't heavy. The wooden frame wasn't heavy. But in the moment she held it, she remembered everything. The clatter of the stainless steel tray, Diesel's eyes behind the bars, Owen pinned to the bed, the fake tear on the white coat, the text threatening her mother, and the soundless video that had finally given a soldier his voice back. After the ceremony, Owen and Rachel stood in the hallway of the memorial hall. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass doors, casting thin golden streaks across the stone floor. Diesel sat between them, his head tilting toward Rachel as if waiting for a familiar command. Owen looked out into the courtyard, where the American flag rippled against the pale blue Nevada sky. "I used to think that if the truth was just spoken, everything would feel lighter right away," he said. Rachel stood beside him. "Does it feel lighter?" Owen was quiet for a moment. He reached down and stroked Diesel's head. "A little, but it still hurts." Rachel nodded. "Yeah, justice doesn't erase the pain. It just stops the pain from being called a lie." Owen looked at her, then offered a very faint smile. "That's enough for a start." Down the hall, a young boy of about 10 was standing with his mother. He looked at Diesel with a mix of curiosity and reverence. Seeing this, Owen leaned down and murmured a quiet command to the dog. Diesel stood up, walked slowly over to the boy, and sat down. The boy reached his hand out hesitantly. Diesel gently rested his snout against the small palm. Rachel watched the scene and felt a wound inside her, close, just a fraction. Not all of it, just a little. But sometimes, a little piece is proof enough that the darkness didn't win. From then on, whenever Rachel admitted a new veteran at the clinic, she didn't start with the questions on the intake form. She started by observing where they sat, facing the room, where they placed their hands, who the dog beside them was trying to shield, and what their eyes were desperately trying to say before their mouth could even open. She taught the younger nurses the exact same thing. Don't be too quick to call a survival reflex violence. Don't separate a soldier from their last anchor just because the protocol finds it inconvenient. Don't let a clean chart override the truth. The diesel protocol couldn't save the past. It couldn't turn back the clock on that ER night and erase Owen's terror. It couldn't make Rachel forget the feeling of an entire hallway turning its back on her, but it changed the nights that followed for everyone else. And that is what a true legacy is supposed to do. It doesn't turn tragedy into a cold monument. It turns it into an open door for the people who come after. An ordinary person can do the extraordinary if they simply have the courage to hold their ground when everyone else is backing away. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Rachel, Owen, and Diesel's story. If this journey made you believe that justice can still begin with one small person taking a stand against a massive system, hit that notification bell to be the first to follow our next tale of courage.